Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Dan McClellan. We're going to dive into the book of Isaiah. How many people wrote it? Was it just one, or were there multiple? We'll find out what Dan says. We'll also talk about the Book of Mormon's Isaiah problem. What does Dan think about that? We'll also get into when did Israel become monotheistic? Might be a lot later than you expected. It was definitely a lot later than I expected, I'll tell you that. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. I'm trying to figure out where to go. William Dever, one of my favorite archaeologists, has a book called God Had a Wife.
Did God Have a Wife?
Or Did God Have a Wife? That's
all of his books are snazzy questions. So, who were the early Israelites and where did they come from? Did God have a wife?
I would so love to get him on. I don't think he does podcasts, but
probably not.
Yeah, if you have any connections, let me know. So the idea is, and you've kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, Asherah and El, or
and El, yeah. So
they were a couple.
Right. So El is the patriarchal high deity, and Asherah is the consort. So at Ugarit, you have the children of El are also referred to as the children of Asherah, and Asherah and El are a pair. And so the 70 children of El are basically all the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, and they are that
70. That's interesting, right. Like a quorum of 70. Is that where we get that from?
So it's based on this. 70 anciently was just kind of a symbolic number for a lot. So today we would say, a million or a billion. I played golf the other day. I shot 1 million. You didn't really shoot 1 million. That's just kind of a symbolic number for a lot. And so 70 was a symbolic number. But if we go into Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, we have this tradition of Elyon dividing up the nations according to the number of the. And then in the King James Version, in the Masoretic text, it says the B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel. But from the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that originally it said the B'nai Elohim, the children of God. And if you look in other places in Genesis, Genesis 10, traditions about Jacob, the idea was that there were 70 nations on the earth. And so in Deuteronomy 32, it also seems like the number of the B'nai Elohim was 70. So we have the same concept of children of God numbering 70, who are children of Elyon, or El, the Most High, this patriarchal high deity. And in Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, verse 9 says, so we have Elyon dividing up the nations according to the number of the children of God. And Adonai's portion is Jacob. Israel was the lot of his inheritance. In other words, Adonai is identified as one of the B'nai Elohim, one of the children of God. So this would correspond with the Ugaritic pantheon, which has El and Asherah as the divine parents, and then Baal as one of the children of God, who is the storm deity. And this is one of the indications that Adonai was probably distinct from the God of Israel in earlier periods and was considered one of the children of God.
Because somebody told me that Baal and Adonai were brothers.
So if we take Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 as an indication that Adonai was one of the B'nai Elohim, one of the children of God, then Baal would have been one of the other B'nai Elohim. So yeah, you could call them brothers. I don't think there are any texts that say that, but yeah, that would work that way.
So El is the father god, Baal and Adonai are sons
children
of God.
Yeah, so there are these second-tier deities who have responsibility. And now they're competing for
would
the same
Asherah
role.
have been a daughter of God in that
Asherah
sense?
would have been the wife.
No, she would have been
consort.
the wife of El. That's
right. And so this is what makes people wonder, well, why is Adonai have Asherah as a consort? And that's because at one point, probably around 1000 BC, this article you mentioned, you suggested that the argument is going to be that Josiah is the one who merged Adonai and El.
Right.
So I think that's probably too late, because I think we have texts, inscriptions from before Josiah's time period that identify Adonai and El, and identify Adonai and Asherah as a pair. So the Kuntilat Ajrud inscription, the Khirbet el-Qom inscription talk about Adonai and his Asherah. And we even have drawings of a male deity, a very male deity, and a female deity with arms interlinked. And the inscription above their heads says, blessings by Adonai and his Asherah. So I would argue that it was probably somewhere around 1000 BCE that El and Adonai were merged. Probably.
Oh, that early.
I think it was probably around that time period, but we don't have a ton of data. But by the 9th century, we have in Israel and Judah, we have kings who are independently attested in some other inscriptions. So the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, the Tel Dan inscription. We have kings whose names have Yahwistic theophoric elements, and which would suggest to me that the kingdom has already put Adonai at the pinnacle of the pantheon. And so I think it was probably somewhere around 1000 BCE, because Adonai probably was a lower level deity until somebody acceded to the kingship, took the throne, who was a worshiper of Adonai, and probably decided, if we're going to have our people, if we're going to have Adonai be more widely worshipped, we need to merge these two deities and make them one and the same. And that way I can consolidate power. I not only have my Adonai followers, but I have my El followers as well. And so, that could have been Saul.
Oh.
There's...
Because the Tel Dan stele, that's the first reference of King David, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah.
It talks about the house of David, right. And so many scholars would say that suggests, if not that there was a real house of David, at least that very soon, very shortly after that whole period is placed, there's a tradition about a house of David. So it functions as some kind of evidence for the historicity of a house of David. And there have been some good, a couple of people have written books on what may be historical behind the story of the rise of David. So Jacob wrote a book on David, Joel Baden wrote a book on David, and I think have advocated for some historicity there, that there was probably a historical King David, but certainly not what we find in the biblical texts. That has been flourished and elaborated on quite a bit.
Big fishtail, basically. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so where was I going? William Deaver. Is that kind of his position, that Asherah and El, and I don't know if I should say / Adonai, were together, basically?
If I recall, it's been a while since I've read his book. It was published in 2005 originally. But yes, the idea was that the God of Israel had as their consort or their wife Asherah. And that,
I mean, in some ways, that's really, what's the word? Some LDS would embrace that because we kind of have a Heavenly Mother. Is Asherah a Heavenly Mother?
I mean, that's up for other people to negotiate. There are complications with that, like the timing and how where this all comes from is a little difficult to reconcile with LDS concepts of
because it's
Heavenly
more polytheistic,
Mother.
Right?
But I do think that we've got to negotiate with this if we're going to make it fit a contemporary worldview anyway. And so if folks want to think of it that way, I'm certainly not going to stop them. But I will point out that there are complications with that, but there are complications with pretty much all attempts to honor both the scholarship and devotional approaches to God.
Right. So let's see, where do I want to go next? We've been talking a little bit about Isaiah and Deutero-Isaiah. I've heard actually up to 4 possible authors of Isaiah.
Okay.
Have you heard that, or
I think the standard these days is 3.
3. Okay.
Yeah. So we have 1 through 39, 40 through 55, then 56 through 66.
And so why do people believe that there are multiple authors of Isaiah?
Well, if you read through the book of Isaiah, paying careful attention to the language, what they're talking about, how they're framing things, right at chapter 40, there's a marked shift. That we're now not talking about a pre-exilic Israel looking forward to, this judgment from God. We're now talking about all of this stuff as if it's in the past, and not in kind of a prophetic way. This is, the point of view has shifted. The author is now looking back at the exile from a later time period. Suddenly, Isaiah's name vanishes. From 40 through 2nd Isaiah, 40 to 55, the author nowhere claims to be Isaiah. Nowhere claims to be doing prophecy. It's all looking back at what's going on and talking about what has happened and Israel's relationship to the nations around them. So that shift in and of itself is reason to wonder what's going on here. The text has changed significantly. And then you have another shift when you get into 3rd Isaiah, or Trito Isaiah, as some scholars call it. Now we're looking back at the Persian Empire. We're looking back at Cyrus having conquered Babylon and allowing Israel to go back to their homeland.
And Cyrus would be what we would say modern-day Iran, right?
Yes, Cyrus was Cyrus the Great, the leader of the Persian Empire. But we actually have that we already have that in Isaiah 45:1, where it calls Cyrus by name, my anointed, or in the Greek translation, my Christ.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Cyrus is one of the only people named as an anointed of God in the Hebrew Bible, and that's the Persian emperor.
I hate to ask this question, but was he the Donald Trump of his day?
I think he was a little more empathetic than Trump. The Persian Empire found that they had a different approach, that a happy subject was an obedient subject. So they actually allowed people to return to homelands. They allowed them to do the worship that they wanted to do. And so in many ways, Persia had a lighter imperial hand than the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire before. But when scholars examine what's going on in Isaiah 1 through 39 and 40 through 55 and the later ones, they're just three very, very different perspectives that are being represented, different time periods, different styles, different content. And when we try to home in on when is this being written, when would this literature have the most rhetorical impact, like when does this seem to be, when do these issues seem to be the most pressing? We have 1st Isaiah, probably the earliest portions are in the 8th century, probably go back to a historical Isaiah with some later insertions. And then 2nd Isaiah is something that was probably written in the late exilic or post-exilic period. And then 3rd Isaiah is probably written in the Hellenistic period. So,
can you give approximate years for those?
Yeah, so the exilic period would start right around 600 BCE.
Okay, so that's Lehi time.
So that's Lehi. Lehi's leaving right before Jerusalem falls to Babylon, which begins the Babylonian exile, and that exile ends in 539 BCE. So about 61 years later, Cyrus the Great and the Persian Empire conquers Babylon and takes over. Then we have the beginning of the Persian period, and that lasts until 334-ish BCE when Alexander the Great comes through and ushers in the Hellenistic period.
Okay.
So, yeah, that can be confusing.
Just to finish that up, when did Rome take over from Greece?
So it happened in different places in different time periods, but around 63 BCE is when Rome initially annexes the land that we would refer to as Israel.
When Israel was independent, I guess there was a time before Rome and after Alexander the Great. how approximately do you know when that was?
So yeah, this was after Alexander the Great. You have the Diadochi, which is the fight among his generals for who's controlling things, and you have the Ptolemaic Empire, you have the Seleucid Empire, you have others. You have the Maccabees in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. So right around 165-ish BCE is where you have Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And the Maccabees are able to fight off the pressure from the Seleucid Empire, and so from that time period all the way down to about 63
so
BCE,
about 100 years
ish. Yeah, you have some independence, and you even have some people calling themselves kings. So there is for a period a kind of a restoration of
and that's where we get to Hanukkah. And okay. All right, cool. I wanted to make sure I had that time frame. Okay, so this brings up another question in the Book of Mormon. I do remember there are some critics who say that the Isaiah chapters in the Book of Mormon come from either 2nd or 3rd Isaiah, maybe a combination. I can't remember. Yeah,
it's kind of scattered around, but there are some passages quoted.
And so that would be problematic because they're after Lehi left, right?
Right.
Do you have a comment on that?
It's just as problematic as the fact that Paul seems to be quoted. Even in the King James Version translation of the New Testament. So that kind of stuff is scattered all over the Book of Mormon. But yeah, that's an issue that I don't think has been adequately engaged by Latter-day Saints trying to defend the historicity of the Book of Mormon.
Well, it does seem like most, and so the funny thing was, because I remember I talked to Sandra Tanner about this issue, and I said, it was one of my favorite questions. So you would agree that there was only one Isaiah? You would agree with the BYU scholars there was only one Isaiah? And she said yes. I was kind of surprised. Maybe I shouldn't be, because she's more of a evangelical conservative, and I guess that would be, kind of
that
a conservative
would be the party
position.
Line, yeah. For them as well. It's leaving cards on the table, though. For her.
Yeah. So it was funny because I was like, "Oh, you actually agree with BYU? That's amazing." But I mean, what are your thoughts on that issue?
My thoughts on that are that we don't have a good enough idea of how Joseph Smith is supposed to have translated the Book of Mormon. There are tight control translation theories. There are loose control translation theories, and if you argue for tight control, that brings all these things in, and you find yourself having to stake claims that are not really defensible.
Right.
The loose control translation theory brings in other issues, and a lot of those issues have to do with authority and with boundary maintenance and things like that. But that allows you to get around some of those issues by saying the way the text is articulated can also be the responsibility of the modern people involved, Joseph Smith, others who are writing these things. And I think there are arguments to make that Joseph Smith's own experiences and life found their experiences in life found their way into the pages of the Book of Mormon. Don Bradley has been doing a lot of good work on how some aspects of the Book of Mormon seem to reflect things that were going on in Joseph Smith's lifetime. And I don't think there's a case to make that Joseph Smith's own agency was not involved in the articulation of the Book of Mormon. I don't see a case to make for that. And so I think Latter-day Saint authors who want to preserve the inspiration of the Book of Mormon need to find a way to negotiate with that observation. Otherwise, I think it's drawing lines that are not incredibly defensible and are coming down to dogmatism and are not adequately grappling with the data. I think if you want the Book of Mormon to be an ancient text at all, you have to acknowledge that Joseph Smith played a role in its articulation in some way, shape, or form. Now that's not, I'm not making that argument myself. I'm just observing that if you want to preserve that, I don't see a way you can do it without acknowledging Joseph Smith had a hand in it to some degree or another.
Because I don't know, I mean, I agree with you. I don't know how anybody can look at the Book of Mormon and maintain a tight translation policy. I mean, I'm trying to even think of who's left. Is it Royal Skousen? Is he the only one?
I don't know where Royal Skousen stands these days. My understanding is that his stance has softened a little bit, but I don't want to be speaking out of school because I really don't know. Yeah.
I mean, we can look at the Old Testament, and it seems like the Israelites were always having a problem with idol worship.
Yeah.
throughout the whole entire Old Testament. Can we pinpoint at this time as to when did that actually end, and then they became true monotheists?
I don't think the idol worship is a good proxy for the threshold of monotheism, but I think that once in my book I argue that the attention, the things that divine images were supposed to do for people were accomplished by the text of the law and by the biblical text itself. And so I think once the biblical text became the locus of authority and the locus of divine presence, you had less of a problem with people resorting to idol worship. At that point, the idol worship was probably more a product of feeling pressure to fit in with the broader empire, whichever empire was in control. And so I think that's probably what eased the pressure of the whole idol worship thing, was we came up with a substitute. And that would be the text of the law, the Torah, and then the biblical text, and then the Bible once that was formulated. So I think that takes the place of idol worship. But monotheism itself, I think, was something that required quite complex philosophical frameworks to develop. And so I think that was something that was probably medieval in origin, something that didn't happen until you get into medieval Jewish, medieval Islamic philosophers, and then later Christian
See, that
thinkers.
seems way too late for me and for most people.
Yeah, that's the case that we're going to be making in our...
Because, I mean, this kind of gets into the New Testament period, I guess, which we can go there. Because, you know, there's the whole argument about the Trinity, and, you know, for the Christians were accused of not being monotheists, weren't they? Because if we have a Son of God, how can that be monotheism?
Yeah, and this was one of the things that the Trinity is trying to resolve.
Right.
It's trying to...
and so that was like Constantine, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's around that time period, yeah. But
so even back then, I mean, that's clear. That's before the medieval times, right?
Right.
So even back in the 4th century, you know, 300s, Christians were being accused of not being monotheists because they believed in God and Jesus.
Right. Now, that's mostly about who they're worshiping. And so a lot of this comes down to how you understand monotheism. Is it the belief that only one God exists? Is it the worship of only one God? Is it both? Is it something else entirely? When we look at the development of the word monotheism and how it's used when it gets created, it's not just one deity. That's a bit of an etymological fallacy. That's what we see when it first shows up in dictionaries, is this idea that monotheism just means belief in one deity. But when the word is created and is developed, it's not just one deity. It's one deity who creates out of nothing. It's one deity who is immaterial. It's one deity who has all these other features associated with it. It's not reducible down to just the concept of one deity. And that's from the guy who came up with the term, Henry Moore, all the way through to today. Monotheism is kind of a conceptual package that's pretty complex. So when we want to go look into antiquity, you don't see the idea of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, until the 2nd century CE at the earliest. That's the academic consensus right now, is that it developed in the late 2nd century by Christians. You don't have the idea of the complete immateriality of deity until even after that. 3rd, 4th century is when you pivot towards a deity that is not corporeal at all. And so it depends on how you want to understand the concept of monotheism, but if we look at how people use the term and try to suss out all of the stuff they mean by the term, that whole package is something that I would say doesn't really firm up until the medieval period. But there are aspects of it, there are constituent elements of it that I would agree are earlier than that. So go back to debates in the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th century CE about one God, and even debates about the materiality of deity and things like that that are 2nd, 3rd, 4th century CE. So I don't think there's a clear line we can draw and say on one side is not monotheism, on the other side is monotheism. I think we have a whole constellation of features, and we can point to some ones that are kind of central to the idea that are starting to crystallize as we get from the 2nd into the 3rd and the 4th century CE. But I would say the package itself we don't see until the medieval period, and it's Jewish and Muslim philosophers who are coming up with it first, and then the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment is where Christianity, I would argue, picks up on it. But that's an argument that I'm still developing for a book that I'm writing. So.
Oh wow! so preview.
So yeah, that's a bit of a preview.
Well, I'm glad. I guess I'm still stuck on the Trinity, because it seems to me the reason why Christians came up with the Trinity was to resolve this problem about whether Christians were polytheistic or monotheistic. But I mean, I understand that the word didn't appear until the 1700s, but isn't that what the argument's about?
I think the argument's about who's being worshipped. And so is it only one God that's being worshipped, or are you worshiping multiple deities? And the worship of multiple deities, I think, is related, but is not the whole picture. And so, because like today, if you look up monotheism in the dictionary, it doesn't say worship of only one God. It says belief that only one God exists. The worship of only one God to the exclusion of any others that may exist. There have been a couple different terms that have been floated as replacements for that. So one of them is henotheism, one of them is monolatry. You also have this other one that is not very popular, monarchism. All these are ideas that we only worship one God, but we don't deny that other deities exist. And so historically, scholars have not liked using the word monotheism to communicate that idea. So it's messy, and like there's obviously the debates that are going on leading up to the Trinity are very closely related to what develops later when they talk about monotheism. But I don't think they're the exact same thing, and I don't think it provides any clarity to argue they're the same thing. I think people want them to be the same thing because that creates ideological continuity with the past, and it says we're just the same as them. And so the scholars who would argue, oh no, they were monotheists who wrote the New Testament, they're arguing that because it means they get to be part of the same group.
Right.
They're one of us, we're one of them. And so that serves entirely distinct rhetorical purposes than what I think the academic endeavor should be aiming for, which is to understand how they functioned, not to make them, to rope them into our group, if that makes any sense.
I mean, it does. I feel I'm fighting within myself because it's so, I mean, I love this kind of conversation, but in my study of early Christianity, and I can't touch you, but I think I'm better than the average bear.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt.
And so, because the Christians, and especially in the Roman Empire, would make fun of and I don't know a better word other than the pagans, the ones who worshipped Zeus and, Jupiter and Mars and everybody, like, how stupid, what is dumb religion? Like, they used to insult the Roman religion all the time, and even, what's that guy's name? There was a wonderful PBS series called The First Christians. There's 2 parts to it. I'm trying to remember what the scholar was, but he was talking about just how the Christians would just make fun of the Romans all the time, and that the Romans, had to make an accommodation for, especially at least the Jews, because the Christians were just a weird cult, you know, that they would only worship one God, because, I mean, Caesar was a god, right? Julius Caesar. And so under the Roman religion, you had to accept that the emperor was a god, and so they just had to accommodate these Jews who were just like, no, we are never going to worship Caesar. We don't believe in that. And so it just seems like, and maybe this is just me projecting back, but it seems like the Jews were very even monotheistic, especially under the Roman Empire. Am I reading that wrong, or?
Well, I think if we look at a lot of the data, and folks like Paula Fredrickson and Matthew Novenson and others have done a lot of good work recently to show that the picture is a lot more complex. And if you were in a Jewish group, when you were just among yourselves, not worrying about what was going on outside, you know, we see headstones that reference other deities, and we see dedications and patrons of certain organizations that have Jewish names, and they're making donations in the names of other deities and stuff like that. Like, among themselves, it didn't seem to be a big deal to acknowledge other deities and even to make offerings and things like that.
Other deities such as?
Roman deities. Yeah.
Zeus, Mars, Jupiter, everybody.
Yeah. But when somebody from the outside came in and challenged you or tried to force something upon you, that's when you would say, no, we don't do that. And so it was about that schismogenesis. It was about that boundary maintenance. It was about distinguishing your identity from the oppressor or the person who's trying to come in and trying to manipulate you or influence you. And so I think it's situationally emergent. There are times when you would say, oh yeah, not a big deal, I don't care. And there are other times when you would draw the line in the sand to preserve your identity, to preserve your autonomy, and to draw that distinction. And so I think it really is complex, and it doesn't come down to they all had this idea in their heads that there could be only one deity and that it was totally inappropriate to ever do anything that acknowledged or gave worship or praise to other deities. I think it was something where in certain situations we want to project this idea, and in other situations wasn't as big a deal. And that's what hopefully we're going to address in this conference come next March, talk about how the picture is muddied by the actual data on the ground that shows that people were acknowledging other deities. There were people who named their kids after other deities. There were people who donated money so buildings could be built where other deities were being worshipped or acknowledged or things like that. So yeah, and we see similar things going on even in Latter-day Saint culture. I mean, there are times when you know, we have pretty red lines that we draw within our culture, but there are other things where you know, we might say the ox is in the mire. It's not as big a deal.
It reminds me, I was working at a BYU game recently, and was he a producer, director? One of the guys said, you know, it's really funny that BYU has a coach named Pope. Mark Pope.
Yeah. But, you know, with things like modesty culture, you know, we've got, you know, you're not allowed to wear something that goes above this unless you're playing volleyball. And you can be on TV and everything.
Right.
And you can be wearing...
or basketball. I mean,
or
BYU,
basketball, yeah.
You
can have the
garment.
Yeah, like those are situations where in certain situations, not a big deal. In other situations, we're drawing a hard line there. And it's a hard no from us.
Okay, so that's what you're saying when the Jews would make offerings to Mars or Apollo or whoever. Yeah,
I think there were situations where it wasn't as big a deal, and then there were other situations where their identity was on the line, or where their autonomy or even their safety was on the line, and that is where they had to do the credibility enhancing display or the costly signaling to project outward. This is who we are, and we're not going to compromise, even though when, you know, the Romans weren't around, it wasn't as big a deal. So I think it's a complex question, and we're taking contemporary categories and then just trying to put them in antiquity, and it gets messy. So I don't like reducing it to oh yeah, they were definitely monotheists, when we're manipulating the way we understand monotheism just to make sure that it fits.
Well, it reminds me of the story, I'm trying to remember where I read this, that Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, he was the governor of Michigan, and he used to have alcohol in his house, and he would serve it to his guests just kind of as a polite thing. I mean, I can't imagine growing up with alcohol in my house.
Yeah, well...
But he would do this just because everybody drank, and he was just being accommodating.
And there are, and with Steve Young and Bryce Harper, they get held up as wonderful examples of the
Bryce
faith.
Harper, are you sure?
Well, not in that sense, but they get highlighted as Latter-day Saints who have worked probably almost every single Sunday of their adult life. And so it's situational when these lines have to be drawn and when they don't. And even I, working for the, I'm worried I keep hitting my microphone. And even I, when I would travel for work, there wasn't a Sunday that I was gone somewhere for work where I didn't eat in a restaurant. And so, there's just times when the line gets drawn and other times when it doesn't. And so I think it does more damage to our ability to understand how they lived their Judaism or their Christianity in antiquity to say, oh yeah, they were definitely monotheists. It doesn't help us understand things that way. And so I'd rather we say it's complex, so that we don't then, because if we say, oh, they were all monotheists, that colors how we reconstruct their lived experiences anciently, because then we shove aside all those experiences where they didn't draw those lines, and we don't get to understand the experiences fully. So, but yeah, it's still a healthy debate, and I'm sure it will be for many years to come. But that's the position I take on it.
Okay, very good.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Dan McClellan. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the wise men. Did they come from Iran?
From the East, the Iranian-associated wise people would be the most likely candidates. So
most likely?
I think so. A friend of mine named Eric Van den Eyck just published a book on the Magi, which is like literally 4 or 5 months ago.
Thanks for listening to Gospel Tangents. If you'd like to support me, please subscribe at gospeltangents.com or on patreon.com/gospeltangents, or you can watch entire videos at youtube.com/gospeltangents. I really can't do this without your support. I'd love to do it full time, and I need a lot more people that are willing to help me out. So I'd really appreciate that. So thanks again for listening, and don't forget to check out some of our other videos.